I told you yesterday, the explosive Durham Report has exposed not just the lies around the Russian collusion hoax, but also showed just how compromised the FBI and Justice Department have become and why trust in those institutions has plummeted. Special Counsel John Durham's 316-page report is devastating for those who push the Russian collusion lie for 4 years. The Democrats and the media's complicity in this saga have been, well demonstrated, but this report found the FBI should never have launched its investigation and that it had no real evidence before it launched its probe, and it knew that. As James Bovard wrote in the New York Post, Durham exposed how the FBI and Justice Department plotted to rig the 2016 presidential election. This is serious stuff. This is as serious as it gets. Joining me from Florida is Newsweek opinion editor Josh Hammer. Josh, thank you so much for joining me tonight. This report confirms what many of us have been saying for years, but the fact remains that the FBI and Justice Department have been hijacked by political ideologues willing to compromise the integrity of those institutions.
You know, Rita, look, for those of us who've been paying attention closely to these affairs for years now, there's nothing in the Durham Report that is a particularly big surprise. So the fix has been in since the start. I mean, the fix has basically been in since the 2016 presidential election effectively concluded. I mean, Michael Flynn, who was supposed to be President Trump's first national security advisor, was basically out before Donald Trump could even be president. But what the Durham Report does confirm, and you've seen some liberal media outlets here in the United States slowly start to finally, years overdue, acknowledge what should have been obvious all along. So what it confirms is that the Russia collusion delusion, this massive hoax that was foisted upon the American people, was bought and paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. That is just the plain truth. I mean, what happened was the FBI, which is supposed to be a neutral law enforcement agency, the federal wing of the law enforcement apparatus in these United States, basically took in a Hillary Clinton campaign talking point, a talking point that they had laundered through a Tony Whiteshoe law firm called Perkins Coie, working hand in hand with political opposition research and scare quotes firm Fusion GPS, with the Steele dossier of the discredited former British spy Christopher Steele. I mean, all of the actors here, those of us in the know, Rita, have been paying attention to all of this for years. What I want to know, and unfortunately where the Durham Report, I think, leaves some of us like myself hanging, is what is going to happen next. So the Durham Report does not ultimately conclude with further recommendations for additional reprisals, additional prosecutions. To date, John Durham has basically failed, actually. He has effectively failed in seeing justice for those who perpetuated massive malfeasance and wrongdoings here. I mean, the only person who was paid any modicum of justice is a former FBI lawyer by the name of Kevin Kleinsmith, who forged a FISA surveillance warrant application. But even Kevin Kleinsmith has not served jail time. He is basically he got off with probation. So, and this was back in January 2021. So unfortunately, there are a lot of answers still to come. But for now, give credit where credit is due. It took a very, very long time and cost a lot of money to get us here. But the report, other than the lack of referrals for criminal prosecution, I think is a very good thing.
But surely there has to be consequences here, Josh. You cannot have this sort of behaviour, this sort of fraud, you could almost call it, undermining democracy, undermining trust in these institutions without some sort of consequences, without charges, without people serving jail time. Surely that is going to be what the Republicans demand after they had a sitting president whose entire time in office was hijacked by this saga.
Right. And I'm sure that some House Republicans right now are either getting ready to file articles of impeachment or possibly already in the drafting process with their lawyers. At least I hope so. And, if you look at what Congressman Jim Comer of Kentucky is doing when it comes to his investigation into the Biden family, which, famously kind of came onto the scene here in the U.S. just last week or so ago. So there are some Republicans who are starting to kind of get to the epicenter of all that went wrong during those 4 years that Trump was president. But But if they're not, then they're slacking. But fundamentally, there's only so much House Republicans can do when the Democrats control the Senate and the White House. So you can file articles of impeachment. You can even vote to impeach. Now, Republicans have a very, very, very slim majority in the U.S. House, so I don't even think it's necessarily a rock solid case that they would have the votes for impeachment. It depends on, of course, on who they would choose to impeach. But, it is worth flagging, Rita, and this is kind of the one fact that I keep on coming back to over the past 24 to 36 hours as I've started to digest this story. The one fact is that Christopher Wray is still the director of the FBI. I mean, this is the same Christopher Wray who assumed office after Jim Comey was unceremoniously fired in the spring of 2017. Chris Wray has been there all along. I mean, that is utterly mind-blowing. I mean, for the life of me, I don't understand why President Trump didn't fire Chris Wray, but at a bare minimum, I would like to see some serious actions taken against Chris Wray right now. There was a tweet earlier today here in the U.S. from the FBI's official Twitter account, which basically said, we acknowledge there were wrongdoings, but serious corrective measures have been taken in place. And, in Twitter lingo, that tweet got ratioed, which basically means that there were far more negative comments and quote tweets than there were actual likes or retweets. Now, put another way to kind of get out of the Twitter language here, what that means quite simply is that Americans are mocking the FBI. And that is not a good state of affairs here in the United States.
Well, we know trust in the FBI is plummeted amongst conservatives. They view the body now with suspicion, and I think rightly so. This isn't an isolated case. Now, Trump has celebrated the release of this report. He posted on social media, wow, after extensive research, Special Counsel John Durham concludes the FBI never should have launched the Trump-Russia probe. In other words, the American public was scammed, just as it is being scammed right now by those who don't want to see greatness for America. Do you think this report's going to have any sort of impact on the 2024 election?
I'm not sure, right? Because I unfortunately, to be clear, it should. I mean, it probably should, but I'm not sure it actually will. I mean, the news cycle here in the United States, just like in Australia, it happens so quickly. There are so many major nuggets of information that happen in the course of a given news cycle, to say nothing of a week or a month. So unfortunately, what I said is true. Some liberal media outlets, some folks, I think even on CNN, from what I've seen, have started to acknowledge the veracity of the Durham Report, have started to acknowledge that there were serial misdoings that happened. But many other liberal outlets have chosen to kind of take in the party line. And, it's worth noting that Joe Biden himself, who, the man who more than anyone else in this country benefited immensely from the Russia collusion delusion. He benefited, in fact, so much that he won the presidency because his opponent was tarred and feathered as Vladimir Putin's stooge. It is worth noting that Joe Biden, at best that I can tell, has not had a single word to say about the Durham Report. So I think that says, unfortunately, Rita, all you need to know, which is that the Democrats and their various lapdogs, their lackeys in the mainstream media and the corporate press are just going to continue to try, for the most part, to bury this story. Again, there have been some people that I've seen who have at least acknowledged it. They've played it lip service. But I fear that for at least half of America's multifaceted, sprawling media ecosystem, for at least roughly half of that, the left-leaning half, this story will effectively be forgotten by next week, which it should not be. I mean, it absolutely should not be. If you go back again to the origins of the Russia collusion hoax, we were talking in the summer of 2016, before the presidential election of the year was even decided. If you go back to that through today, I mean, it's literally 7 years ago. I mean, this is one of the greatest hoaxes ever perpetuated upon the American people. And, it really is not asking too much to see some semblance of justice there. So I hope that people on our side continue to kind of push this and seek ultimately justice and retribution. But I can't tell you that I'm particularly optimistic that it's going to play a major role in next year's presidential election.
Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Anytime, Rita.